Hey, special educators, I'm Jennifer from Positively Learning. Welcome to the Special Educators Resource Room. If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to save time and streamline your work. That's why this podcast was created, to give you the systems and solutions you need to get your time back. Tune in for tips, tricks, and tools that will help you manage your workload and make the most of your time. Whether you're brand new or experienced, all are welcome in the Special Educators Resource Room. Hey, special educators, this is Jennifer from Positively Learning. Let's talk about data collection. In this episode, we're going to be focused in on how to fit data collection in to everything else we're trying to do. Before I dive into what worked for me, I want to share a story from the beginning of my career. I think it's safe to say I was not the most confident special educator. I had imposter syndrome, I felt overwhelmed, and I really noticed that the things I'm hearing in professional development, any type of training I took, grad classes, was not necessarily matching what I saw in my own classroom. And I felt it was all because I had no idea what I was doing. And it could be very true. But what I was noticing was that I was having some success with my students, or at least I thought I was, because they were happy, they were learning, I was taking data and seeing progress. But then I would sit in these trainings about formal research-based strategies, and I could see a huge gap. In my mind, what I was doing with the task cards and the games just didn't feel very professional. It wasn't official. I was supposed to be using all of these very formal data tracking forms and sheets. All right, so I wasn't having a lot of confidence. And I remember having a conversation with our school psychologist, who was quite established. She was amazing. We shared many of the same students. So she was pushing in quite a bit to take some observations and seeing what we were doing every day. And I must have had so many conversations with her, and she probably could tell I wasn't feeling really comfortable, and I was sort of apologizing and making excuses. So for example, I would show her how a student was doing when we played this game or did these task cards. And I'd say, well, I know this isn't like research based, but this is what I'm seeing. And I must have done this too many times because she stopped me dead in my tracks. And she said to me, no, what you are doing is research based. You are trying things, you're taking data, you're reflecting on the data, you're making adjustments in real time with your students. That's what research is. I never forgot that conversation. I felt so much better about myself because, again, my students were making progress and I did have the data to back that up. I just thought it didn't count because it wasn't official. And she really helped me see that we are doing research in our classrooms day in, day out. So I try to pass this message on as much as possible. Now let's get to the tips. So these are the everyday things that you can be doing in your classroom that could lend themselves to collecting a quick data point. Now, I've shared many already in previous episodes. I will put the links in the show notes, but very quickly, a rundown is episode 32. I talked about work samples and how I made it really easy to collect and organize them. And in episode 29, I talked about student data tracking and all the different ways you can incorporate it. So with those two things in place, kind of behind the scenes, you already have data being collected on a consistent basis. So now let's get to the other tips that you can use in your everyday instruction. This first tip is for small groups, although you could probably adjust it for any group you're working with. So in my role, I was pulling small groups throughout the day, every day. So I may be pulling 5 different groups, whether I'm pushing into the inclusion classroom or I'm pulling out to the resource room setting. As I worked with small groups, maybe 5, 6, 7 students, I always made a point to zero in on 2 students with the intention of grabbing a data point. So if I'm working with 5 groups that day, that's 10 students I'm checking in with. Now I'm checking in with all of my students and keeping an eye and using observation, but these 2, I'm specifically trying to grab a data point from. So in my small groups, groups, we usually had 3 things going on. One was some type of opening activity, often a knowledge recall, activate prior knowledge style activity. So it could be task cards, we could be sorting, something like that. And that lend itself to grab a quick data point. If there's 2 students I had in mind, when each student had their turn to participate, maybe they did 5 cards. Well, there's a data point. They had 3 out of 5. I could get 60% right there. The next part of our lesson was some type of guided practice that was released and then it turned into independent practice. Well, there I am. I can use observation to see how my students are doing. And then we always closed with some type of performance task, very similar to the opening. You could consider it like some type of exit ticket style, although my students probably thought we were just playing a game, but that was another time that I could check in. If I had these 2 students, maybe I took data on one student at the beginning, and then I took data on the other student at the end. How did I choose these students? Well, I really looked at my schedule Monday through Thursday. So I'm polling groups. That's 5 groups a day, 10 students. That's 40 students. So I might be checking in with one student twice that week. But what I did is I took the students at the beginning of the week that were just tougher to get. Maybe they were frequently absent. Maybe I only saw them on Mondays, but those were always the priority. And then you know how you have students who have never missed a day of school? I might put them on Thursday because I'm pretty confident I'm going to check in with them. Friday was always left as some type of catch-up day. As far as actually collecting the data, it was often jotted down on a lesson plan. I've talked about this before, but I had learned from this fantastic special educator. I hope she's listening someday. At my school, she was the grade before mine or younger than mine. So I inherited many of her students and I just got to learn so much from her. And I remember she had a space on her lesson plan. And we're not reading the lesson plan, of course, during our instruction, but she always had it on a clipboard close by. And she had a quick 10 frame at the bottom. Well, there's opportunities to grab quick data. You can use the 10 frame. Maybe the top 5 is for one student, the bottom 5 is for another student, whatever works for you. And she would just do a quick yes, no, or tally mark or plus minus, whatever works. So that is how I collected data. By the end of the week, I had all of this data collected. And what was great is if it was on the lesson plan, well, the lesson plan already has what we did during the lesson plus the date. So there's that information there too. Super quick. Okay, the next idea is also with small groups. So in the resource room, when I polled small groups, we always used a rotation model. So if I had a larger group in the resource room setting, maybe 15 students, I would have 3 groups going, 5, 5, and 5. But I also kept this same rotation even if I had just 5 students. Maybe we would have a quick group activity with all 5, but then we would move into our rotation. So maybe I had 2 students at one, 2 students at another, 1 student I'm checking in with. I always kept these routines going. I felt it was important to keep these routines in place and stay consistent whether I was working with a small group or large. I've had plenty of times when I'm working with just 5 students and some situation happened where we had to put out a fire. Maybe it was an individual student that needed some one-on-one attention. I didn't want my other students just sitting there or worse, giving attention to the situation. Instead, I could easily give the direction to get started and they would know exactly what to do because we had those routines. All right, back to data collection. I always had these 3 activities going that we would rotate between. One was often small group where students are going to be working with me. One was our independent work system, which was task boxes. And another was some type of independent work, whether students were finishing up something from the gen ed classroom, they were independent reading, or doing another type of activity. So imagine if we were all working in the resource room setting and I cue that we are going to be cleaning up and transitioning to the next activity. So then during the transition, maybe my students would have 3 minutes or whatever is appropriate to move to the next activity. If one of them was me at the small group table, I wouldn't sit at the table and wait for my students, but instead I would circulate around the room, just making sure everyone's getting settled. We know how transitions can go. But what I also was doing was using that opportunity to check in with one or two students. So for example, if my students were at the independent work area, I could check in with them. If they're independent reading, I might take a quick running record with them. If they are at the independent work systems, which is task boxes, well, that was a really easy way to check in and grab a quick data point because they have task boxes and these are always set up for performance tasks. So I might check in for a couple of minutes and grab a quick data point. Now, students at the small group table that are waiting on me as I circulate around the resource room, they have an activity to work on. So when I get up to walk around, I've left something for them. And I do this consistently so they know what to do. I either have left a task box for each student. Important to note, they're different task boxes. So students are not working together at this time. This is where they have their own task box at their seat and they just know to get started right away. You could also put out a printable. So same thing with the printable worksheets. I would have something different for each student. Those would be also great to collect as a work sample. What I loved about this is it made transitions go much better, but also my students never knew who I was going to be popping in with, and they loved it because it was just some one-on-one attention, but they also didn't know who I was going to be checking in with. So it was kind of that element of surprise. It kept everybody accountable, and I'm collecting a data point. So now let's add it all up. I have 2 students I'm checking in with my small groups. I'm pulling 5 small groups at the minimum. So there's 10 students. Now I'm checking in with 1 to 2 students during transitions, and we're having 3 transitions per group for 5 groups. Oh my goodness, like how many people am I checking in with now? So that's why I always felt that data collection was not that hard to grab. I also have the work samples in place and student data tracking. There is one more place I was able to consistently grab a data point every week, and that was through analyzing gen ed classroom work. So my students were responsible for taking a spelling test. I know I've shared this story with you before, and it was wildly inappropriate, especially when you are looking at their IEP goals and objectives. So during the spelling test, they may be doing this dictation style. Teacher says a word, they are writing it down. Although these words are not what I'm measuring progress on for my students, maybe they have goals with letter sound correspondence. I can use the same student work to get that data point on how they're doing with their initial sounds. I'm going to wrap it up here, although I do have some more tips, so I will be back with some more. Next week, I would like to share some tips that I used with technology, and they are just as easy as the ones I shared here. But there's 2 points I want to wrap up with today. One is using all of these different ideas and suggestions is going to produce probably way more data than you need. And that's okay. It's up to you. I didn't use it all, but it was nice to have this holistic picture of how my students were doing. So you could pick and choose which activities you want to do, or you could do all of them like I did, and then pick and choose which data made the most sense. And the last point I want to make takes us back to the beginning of this podcast. I felt that this data was much more valid because it was done in a natural setting with my students. Everyday instruction, they knew the routines, they felt comfortable with me. I felt like that data, although it was possibly not as professional and not research-based, I felt it was much more accurate on how my students were doing than if I had done a research-based, a cold, formal, or standardized data collection system. I hope these tips were helpful for you. Definitely check out the show notes. The links that I will put for the previous podcast episodes all about data collection will also be links to a blog post if you prefer to read it or bookmark it for later. And I'll be back next week sharing technology tips for grabbing quick data points throughout the week. Until then, thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time in the Special Educators Resource Room. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm dying to ask, what'd you think? Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe buttons so that you never miss an episode. You can find the show notes and links for everything mentioned in this episode at positivelylearningblog.com. See you next week for more special education solutions.